Before the video starts, it's
Raid Shadow Legends.
I don't think this game needs much of an introduction as most of you already know about it. With over 56 million downloads and an almost perfect score, this is the hottest game out there. Every great game has some serious challenges waiting near the end for those who have the guts to attempt them. In Raid, the end game is the Doom Tower. Doom Tower is a giant prison full of nasty and terrifying monsters being held there until the Arbiter can figure out a way to deal with them. Well, a couple of thousands years later, no solution and the Arbiter's power waning, the eternal prison is failing and it is up to the champions to go there and knock some heads before they get out. Although the floors themselves might be relatively simple to clear, it is the prisoners themselves one needs to watch out for, each with their own unique abilities that require some real tactics to defeat. For example, the Scarab King takes barely any damage unless his max health is reduced, and good luck trying to attack him without a shield buff. With many bosses to slay, loot to gain and champions to master, there is plenty to do. I absolutely love the PvP as it lets me own scrubs, and with over 600 champions each with their own special abilities, powers and advantages, it is fun to try out different squad combinations seeing which work, adding a big tactic aspect to the game. Raid Shadow Legends has a ton of existing content to explore, with constantly new things being added. It is one thing I enjoy about this game as it makes it feel dynamic and alive. On the topic of new content, Raid has a Halloween lineup towards the end of the month, jam-packed with spooky content featuring big rewards, PvP tournaments, brand new legendary champions themed for the occasion, and more to come. Make sure to use the link in the description or scan the QR code to get a massive head start. You'll get 200,000 silver, an XP boost, an energy refill, one ancient shard and an epic hero called Konaru, which is amazing for the Doom Tower content. These rewards will be available only for the next 30 days and only for new players, and will be waiting for you in your inbox as soon as you enter the game. So make sure to grab them while you can. Hello, Enens. I'm writing from Norway, where I've lived for a good half of my life. I'm 24. I've lived mostly in the middle of nowhere, but I've heard and seen all sorts of things, because my environment was mostly village alcoholics, delinquents and high school students. After reading Yakut Kun's stories, I decided to make something along those lines myself. My stories have little in common with the ancient Scandinavian legends, except that the names of the creatures are a bit similar. So, I don't promise any Lovecraftian pathos, but some Scandinavian spooks with a few good laughs. Enjoy. The place of action is northern Telemark. Winter. We are sitting with friends in the woods by the fire, drinking moonshine, baking potatoes, arguing about politics. We got carried away with the argument and didn't notice that we heard voices in the forest, right behind my back. We just thought that the locals were skiing in the woods and that maybe they would join us soon. The voices were male, coming from about 200 meters away, and it was hard to make out the speech. Then they got nasty, like school kids, started laughing, roaring, loud and long grunts, shouting something. But we just fucking kept talking. So, some drunks decided to go skiing in the woods at night without flashlights. It was only then that we realized that it was 3 in the morning, and that this whole situation is not normal. I immediately remembered the stories of the Tussians, or Duffs, creatures that live underground and sometimes come out into our world on business. Tussians are too weak to kill a man. They can only bite his leg, at the most. They can steal a child and replace it with their own. Sometimes Tussians are described as ordinary people in blue robes. I, as the Norwegian old men taught me to do, splashed some moonshine on the ground behind me and quietly said something like, "Here's a present for you, get off our backs now." And the voices instantly died down. But my friends were still worried, and it was getting late, so we went home. The next day we went all around the forest in the area where the voices came from, but we found no traces of people in the snow. The locals told us that sometimes from that forest they could see the smoke of a fire, but when they went to investigate who had started a fire, the smoke disappeared. So, the locals also believe that the Tussians live there. I personally, a couple of years later, witnessed the owner of the forest there sawing pine trees with a chainsaw to build a bathhouse, and, before he started, shouted, "Watch out for falling trees." When I asked him to whom he had shouted this, he answered simply, "In my family it is customary to warn the Tussians," and, as if nothing had happened, he started the saw and began sawing the pine. Another story related to the Thasses. It was told to me by a farmer who lived near Stavanger. I worked in his barn and slept there. Once a week he poured a can of beer behind the barn right on the ground. He said he'd tell me why later. Honestly, I'm glad he told me this story when I was leaving, Otherwise I wouldn't have had the courage to spend the night there, although my brain naively tells me it's just a story from a wacky collective farmer. The setting is the 90s. So this farmer was walking home drunk at night from the pub. His business was not good, his wife left him, taxes, high milk prices, etc. Suddenly, some strange-looking fellows walk up to him on his way, huge noses, warts, crooked eyes, mouths like toads, they speak in an old-fashioned way, and they didn't have an accent. Near Stavanger, everyone has an accent. Well, he thinks to himself that all the farmers on Lake Mound-tusse in the east must look like that. He invites him, in short, to drink, next door in a dugout at some dude's housewarming party. He thought about where the hell would a dugout be in the village, but in his drunken head it did not seem so strange. They go towards his house and really find themselves at a big dugout, where the merry noise and ruckus comes from. Violins playing and all that. There could be no dugout in that place, he was the only farmer at that end of the village. Well, he thinks it could be anything, it must have been built recently, and he didn't notice. The people tell him that, yes, they moved in here recently, we're your new neighbors, let's drink to get acquainted. The dugout inside is overcrowded with even more horrible freaks, someone is puking on the floor, someone in the corner is beating each other up, in another corner a lounge player is playing some cacophony on the violin, the dugout smells of feces and vomit, and on one wall hangs a huge sword with a golden hilt. A normal, in general, rural holiday. But there is not a single electric device in the dugout, and instead of a light bulb, oil lamps are burning. Well, it happens, maybe they are sectarians or something like Amish. If they're drinking, they're brothers-in-law, so he says, let's drink to a housewarming party. Something begins dripping on him from the ceiling. He smells pee. The people tell him that it's normal, they are in the mound under the farmer's cowshed, that's why cow urine is dripping from the ceiling. The farmer suddenly woke up and saw that he was lying with his face on the floor in the middle of the stable, with only cows and pigs around him, and it was already morning. The farmer wasn't even necessarily frightened. He thought to himself, what the hell could possibly have happened? Since then, he poured a can of beer on that mound once a week so his Mound-tusse wouldn't be touched. And, as he said, ever since then he's been doing well, becoming the richest farmer in the village and getting married for the second time to the prettiest girl in the neighborhood. For the record, when I slept in the barn, nothing strange happened. He also said about the sword with the golden hilt is probably buried under the barn, there is likely to be a Viking tomb where the mound is. But he does not need a sword, he is not poor as it is, and he does not want to make the Thusses angry with excavations. On top of that, he'd have to tear down the barn, too. That is why, as he said, he does not allow archaeologists to come within a mile of his farm. In general, I was sympathetic to this, because I myself come from the Urals, and my great-aunt also brought offerings on the mounds of Chuchki. To find more about this topic, one can Google the mythical Chud. Offerings are all carried there, kasha, kvass, something akin to incense that resemble burning cones, etc. Contrary to popular belief, the Lapps do not live only in Lapland. In fact, most of the Norwegian Lapps live in Oslo. But in all seriousness, the Saami are native to almost all of Norway, except in the very south and southwest. In Trøndelag, there are southern Saami who speak a southern Saami language that the northern Saami do not understand. In the Trøndelag village where I lived for a while, there are only 2 Saami families, who roam past there once a year on the mountains with their reindeer, and sometimes send their children from the mountains to the village to buy some food. Besides them, one of the Lapps owns a sawmill in the village itself. His name is Lasse, a Norwegian name. I met him in the village lodge and he invited me to his place on the mountain for a beer. We got on his snowmobile and rode for a long time, until we came to a couple of chums with a bunch of reindeer around them. And not a single tree. I almost went blind from the whiteness of the snow on the way, but he gave me his sunglasses. He had all kinds of stuff in one hut and it was cold there, and he lived with his family in the second, which was as warm as a sauna. We sat and drank beer in the tent with the stuff, and he turned out to be a taciturn type. We didn't talk much in the library either. We just sat in the dark, cold tent, barely speaking, and drank beer with our eyes fixed on the beer crate that served as our table. We sat like that for 3 hours, and I was beginning to wonder why I had gone to drink beer with a stranger in the first place. Then he drove me back and told me that I was a good fellow, if I could drink quietly, and took a piece of venison out of his bag as a present. Finally, he said it was nice to drink beer in company, since he had only a wife and 2 young sons around him all the time. Then, without saying goodbye, he left. In June of the same year, 2018, I decided to go fishing near a mountain waterfall to catch coho salmon. The places there are high, so there are no trees, and there is snow almost everywhere in June. Not many people know that the Siberian salmon reaches so high up there, so only the locals fish there, and even that is rare, because the wind there is strong and cold. It was raining, so the coho salmon swarmed near that waterfall. After catching a bucket's worth, I decided to rest and drink some cognac to warm up. As soon as I settled down, I had a sheepskin for such occasion. I noticed some bearded man in tatters coming towards me, shouting and waving his hands. He ran closer to me and said with a strong Saami accent,
"You better get down the mountain, there's going to be a snowstorm."
First of all, I was surprised. When the hell does a snowstorm occur in June? Secondly, the Saami have all spoken without a distinct accent for a long time now, especially in Trøndelag. Finally, even the homeless and drug addicts in Trondheim don't walk around in such shabby rags as that man. But, what could I do? I wrapped my fishing rod and cognac in my skin, took my bucket of coho salmon with me, and obeyed the call of this idiot. He came with me, pretending not to understand when I asked who he was, what he was doing here and what storm he meant. No sooner had a minute passed than the wind became stronger and the drizzle changed to snowfall. Soon I couldn't see further than an arm's length around me. The man told me to follow him. We had been walking for about 20 minutes, and not down, but along the slope. I could not talk as the wind muffled my words, and there was nobody to rely on but that guy, especially as he knew about the storm beforehand. And then he shouted through the wind that we had arrived. Arrived where? What for? We stepped 2 meters more and I saw the door of some barn. In general, it is not clear how that man was so well oriented, when even a shed from 2 meters cannot be seen. We fell into the shed and there was nothing but bare floor. I spread out my hide, sat down, thanked him for saving our asses and gave him some cognac. As usual, I spread the skin with the wool upwards. The Saami, after drinking brandy, says in broken Norwegian,
"Judaho,
non-Saami that is,
aglet vidos, who has to lay pels with fleece upwards? Both they and sheep wear wool on themselves to warm themselves, so where have you seen a day or a sheep with wool inside out?"
Indeed, I recalled Lasse sitting in the hut precisely by laying the hide on a stool with the wool down. I take it that the skin of the hide would get wet and spoil from the earth's moisture, and the wool protects the hide from that. After that, the Lapp again did not answer my questions and at first he even refused to tell me his name, but then he introduced himself, said his name was Mound-tusse. The storm had abated. The sun appeared in a gap in the wall of the barn. With difficulty we opened the door, which was piled with snow from below, and went outside. There was a blinding whiteness of snow all around. We could hardly see where we were going, or orient ourselves at all. Fortunately, I still had my sunglasses from Lasse. Once again, I thanked the Saami, we said goodbye and parted ways. In the winter, I met Lasse again, who had stopped by to check on the sawmill, and I told him the story. I asked him who that man was. He said,
"There are no Lapps on that mountain, Parya, and there never has been any. The places there are too windy."
And then suddenly he says,
"That's my great-grandfather you met. His name was Magnus Pedersen. He was killed there in the 40s, when he got into a snowstorm, carrying provisions to the partisans."
Lasse then nodded meaningfully and, again without saying goodbye, left. There is a small coastal village in northern Norway where I have stayed several times with an acquaintance. The village harbor used to be popular with fishmongers, but about 20 years ago it burned down, in such a way that no one was able to rebuild it. As a result the village had fallen into disrepair, so the only entertainment there is exploring abandoned huts. There are no jobs at all. From the population remained only fishermen and peasants, though oddly enough, the local youth still stayed there. Although to travel to school and college they have to take a bus that takes an hour, so in the winter, young people rent houses and boarding schools. I haven't heard of any ghost stories there, and the abandoned huts have long since been cleaned out, but the atmosphere there is pretty spooky. Their bunkers from the Second World War are still there. The old folks are all different kinds of freaks. There was even a local retired maniac many years ago. Of the more or less normal old people I know of, is one granny botanist who has a collection of coconuts, which are sometimes carried to the northern shores by sea currents, although there is no such thing in southern Norway. The first story happened to the grandmother's neighbor, who drank himself to death last year. The grandmother, in fact, told me this story. The old man was from around here, but he used to work as a loader in Australia and was a partisan during the war. One day in the 70s he decided to go fishing. He sailed not too far from the shore, a little away from the village, and suddenly he saw an island on the horizon, filled with spruce trees. No island had ever been there, except for rocky shoals, but no forest could grow on them. He had been fishing there since he was a little boy, and he did not remember the shoals there either. It interested the old man. So he swam up to the island to see what the hell was going on. The first thing that caught his eye was that the trees were suspiciously black. I mean, sometimes the trees are very dark, especially in winter, but this was summer. The trees were the color of coal, and the sun was on the side, not behind the trees. He decided to venture onto the island. He saw that the sand was normal, and the pine needles on the sand were also of the usual yellow color, but each needle on the spruces was really black. Then, he noticed something else weird that stuck out to him. There were no birds on the island, even though usually there were a lot of seagulls in similar places. Instead, he was faced with a completely black forest, and total silence. Grandpa got scared. He probably wanted to swim away, although he was not superstitious, and he had seen much scarier things during the war. Anyway, that wasn't what made him swim away, but the fact that among the black spruces was a huge shadow of a slightly different black hue, which he first mistook for a rock in the center of the island. The shadow looked suspiciously like the silhouette of a 5-foot man, and moved slightly, without making a sound. Whether it was a trick of the eye, an illusion or not, the grandfather decided to run away just in case. He got into the boat and swam away from the island. He was afraid to even look back at the island. Though, halfway to his home shore, he was caught in a fog and decided to wait until evening. In those years there was a lighthouse in the village, which was now demolished, so in the evening he could be guided by the lighthouse and get home safely in case the fog did not clear. But even with the onset of darkness, no light was visible anywhere, although the village itself, in theory, should have been lit, as the very outskirts of the village from the other side could be seen. But no, the old man was sitting in the boat in the total darkness and didn't understand what was going on. He was sitting like that till morning and fell asleep. He woke up because his boat was washed ashore in a totally unknown place. He went to look for other people. He dragged the boat to the shore and soon he comes to Brønnøysund, which is 100 kilometers away from his village. But that was not all. He arrived the same day to his home village by bus, and there he found out that he had been gone for a whole week, not just one night, and they thought he had drowned or something. They even called the cops to look for the body. I don't know if it's a made-up story or not, and how the cops explained his disappearance later, but this story was recently confirmed to me by the grandchild of that old man. So if it is a made-up story, it is a story that the grandfather made up himself. If that's the case, perhaps he was out in the pubs at the time of his disappearance. The second strange story of the same village is more real and has to do mostly with youth and crime. The fact is that Easter is considered cursed by the locals. Every Easter, some kind of crime happens, often for no apparent reason at all. It is so serious that on Easter, even a cop comes to keep order, but he has never been able to prevent anything. There hasn't been any mention of this curse in the papers yet. It started in 2013. At that time, there was some kind of party at Easter, and people from neighboring farms came. One guy got drunk and had a fight with his girlfriend and she threw herself off a cliff in grief. No, she didn't die, but she became handicapped. The guy, on the other hand, offed himself a couple of days later, because he thought she was going to die in the emergency room. The next Easter, two collective farmers were fishing for trout, and one of them stabbed the other with a knife, and quite brutally, Varg style. He was a perfectly normal guy, as they say, and he didn't even drink, so it's not clear what got into him. At Easter 2015, a seemingly normal 9th grader broke into the house of the local postmistress and stabbed her in the head with an axe. Of course, one could think that he was a psychopath and decided to make a joke in order to confirm the myth about the cursed Easter, but the two previous incidents were not connected at that time and were considered random, so there was no myth at that time. The next Easter, however, was already being waited on warily. The cop, however, had not yet been called. And yes, two lunatics were passing through the village and their car broke down. They stopped the first car they saw, killed the driver, poured petrol over the corpse and set fire to it, leaving it in a very prominent place on the beach. Then they drove away in the stolen car as if nothing had happened. Soon after, they were caught. In 2017, the local elders had already called a cop, but he urged everyone to calm down and not to believe in the paranormal. But that ended predictably. On Easter, the local youth climbed into an old bunker with a bunch of explosives and decided to experiment with them, which ended in the death of one of them. The explosives were sold to them by a local lunatic who was going to blow up the regional court building. As it turned out, he had made the explosives himself and kept them in a box right next to the radiator, so it was lucky that they exploded in a bunker and not in the village. After that, the cop finally agreed to come, But on Easter 2018 there was a motorcycle accident in the village that he couldn't prevent. Some dude was riding his motorcycle, when suddenly he almost got his head cut off by a wire stretched across the road. The guy drove off the road and crashed into a tree, but miraculously got away with a bad neck cut and a broken leg. No culprits were found, but it was suspected to have been the work of juvenile delinquents. The next and subsequent Passover were accompanied by mere deaths. In 2019 a local drug addict died, the next year 2 retired smokers, either of cancer or of the virus. That said, for all of 2019, other than the junkie, no one died there. Whether anything happened this year, 2021, I don't know, I hope not. On the other hand, except for the Easter curse, the locals have nothing to boast about, because the village, as I said, is depressing. They told me about the curse not so much with fear as with local pride. And in general, they are all crazy there. In short, it's a shame. In connection with the story of the lapse, I was reminded of another mysterious ghost story, but less dramatic. It happened when I was an 8th grader in a Norwegian village school. At the time, a newcomer came to us, a guy from Ukraine named, let's say, Artem. He had a real bass guitar and adored the themes related to the McNarvists, as he himself was from near Goillj-vaskarens. One day our history teacher told us that next week we would be doing a history of the October Revolution, and Artem suggested I should sing a McNarv song at the first lesson on that subject, I on vocals, he on bass. The teacher, strangely enough, supported the idea, but we just told him we were going to perform a revolutionary song. And no, the history teacher was not a member of the Norwegian Communist Party, but the head of the parish cell of the centrists, the Kulak Party, but he did advocate a comprehensive education. Artem found a cool old song and even printed out a bunch of McNav's money coupons on the school printer and scampered off with his parents' firecrackers. I learned the lyrics quickly, but I was terrible at pronunciation. I remember one of the verses was, Denikin's army was going in an avalanche, going to Moscow, all their army was crushed to bits by McNav's Sheena. We took the lyrics from the internet, but we changed some of the words for a better sounding translation. The song didn't fit with the bass playing, and besides, Artem himself admitted that he didn't play it much better than I sang it. So he said that we were going to play in a revolutionary avant-garde style and left only one string on his basso, and I scratched on his guitar the Norwegian word kook. Artem himself spoke bad Norwegian, especially in a rural dialect. The funny thing was that we didn't know anything about punk rock at the time, and we made it up as we went along, knowing only about the verbal experiments of the Krusnik and Karms from my mother's books, which she had given to Artem. Then, one weekend, a girl called us and said she could stand in the background and march with a red flag in her hands while we performed. Artem made up a red and black flag with a pirate skull from t-shirts and attached it to a stick with some rusty barbed wire I found in the street. We borrowed a speaker for our bass from the school, and not before long, we were ready. Before the show I stole some snus, a kind of Norwegian snuff like Nava, from a teacher, but I had never tried it before, so I felt nauseous and dizzy. Artem couldn't keep the snus in his mouth for more than 10 seconds, and then he rinsed his mouth with water for a long time. I decided to show off by saying, Artem, look at me, I'm such a man, I can perform with snus in my mouth. Artem said it would be even cooler, because I looked like I had fought the McNavists myself. My face was green, I could hardly stand on my feet, I couldn't sing and I wanted to vomit. The class laughed at the end of our performance, not so much at our terrible performance, but at the absurdity of what was going on, the song, the flag, why the bass had one string, why I looked so shitty, and so on. The teacher didn't know what kind of performance it was either, but we explained to him in advance that it was a kind of Soviet avant-garde and that we were going to do terrible on purpose. It should be said here that we were performing at the blackboard, looking out the window behind the desks, so only me, Artem and the girl with the flag could see the window. The window itself was located on the 3rd floor, the 1st floor was the pool and movie theater, and the other 2 were our neighborhood school. Outside the window was a field and behind it a wooded mountainside, since the school was on the outskirts of the village for some reason. Towards the end of the song Artem blew up the firecrackers, which had been hidden behind the guitar until then, and I, staggering, began to scatter McNav coupons. Suddenly the girl dropped the flag and ran out of the classroom, shrieking, while Artem ran out after her, laughing and jumping around. I didn't have time to understand what happened, but I glanced at the window. Nestor Ivanovich himself was looking sternly from there, wearing a papa and wagging his finger at me, and then disappeared. It all took just a couple of seconds, after which I vomited right on top of the teacher and fainted. Then I realized that only me, Artem, and the girl had seen McNo. The rest of the class was shocked by our behavior and didn't understand what was going on. The girl had no idea who that dude was outside the third floor window. And it couldn't have been a prank on the teacher's part. We didn't tell him what song we were going to play, and he didn't even know Mukno's name before that. So I don't know what kind of a collective hysteria it was, if not the real ghost of Nestor himself. Perhaps our behavior so disappointed him that he came down from the underworld to Norway to wag his finger at us. Or maybe he was threatening me so that I wouldn't dabble in nicotine at such a young age. We just told the girl later that it was the spirit of a Ukrainian revolutionary and that there was nothing wrong with it. She calmed down after that. Artem, as I mentioned, didn't know whether he was scared or not at all. He just ran out of the classroom with the girl just in case, but he took it with a sense of amusement. We told the teacher that the end of the concert was just a shock improvisation, and that I was the only one that screwed up by trying the snooze. The teacher took away the snooze and said he wouldn't call the parents for this first infraction, and asked us not to have any more concerts like that at school. He did, however, find information about the McNivists and explained to the class what kind of crap we were showing. Because I spoke Norwegian only a little better than Artem at the time and could not explain it to the class intelligently myself. And he even hung our red and black flag on the wall in class. In general, he was a good dude. I remember Yakut-kun mentioning Sulukuns. There is something similar in Norwegian beliefs. At Christmas, it is believed that the water and underground creatures come out at night on the ice of the lakes and the glades and hold fairs there. In part, descriptions of these fairs remind one of the old German myth of the wild hunt. If you sneak up on such a coven and shout cuckoo 3 times, the evil creatures will think it's dawn, and will scatter, dropping all the jewelry they can grab. I once helped a drunkard chop wood. It was in Trøndelag, in a picturesque taiga valley where my friends and I often fish. There was a clearing behind his farm where, they say, the evil spirits once gathered long ago, witches and sorcerers, big mountain trolls, juggers, and ryeses, little underground tusses and punjulisk, swamp girls, neki, and forest centaur girls, Holari. When that drunkard's great-grandfather was still a boy, his parents strictly forbade him to go there in winter after sundown, for they believed it all. Nevertheless, he went there once. It was already dark, and laughter seemed to come from across the clearing. Suddenly a black 2-foot-tall silhouette loomed in the darkness between the pines and said in a satanic tone, "Hey, boy, you want a coin? Then guess my riddle or I'll kill you." At this point I thought, listening to the story, that it was just a children's tale, but it had one unexpected detail, which I'll explain later. I don't know what kind of nerve it takes to do that, but the guy didn't run squealing toward the house, he went along with it. The riddle was, whose horse broke his leg on the bridge? In Norway there is a story, known since medieval times, that the Germanic god Odin was riding his horse over a bridge and the horse broke his leg. Alkas had never heard about this story, so I think he retold it from the words of his great-grandfather. In newer versions of the story, Odin is replaced by Jesus. So the guy, who obviously knew the story, answered Jesus. I don't know if the unknown bully was expecting the Odin answer, but he suddenly yelled loudly and fell through the snow. The boy ran home as fast as he could, where, of course, he got a beating from his parents. In the morning, however, he found a gold coin under his pillow. His great-grandson showed me this coin, which I think was brass, not gold, because it was covered with a layer of patina from old age. It had a crudely depicted horse on one side and the head of some knight on the other. Around the head was written something in incomprehensible signs. I had not seen anything like these signs, triangles, squares, circles, dots, but nothing that looked like Latin, Greek, Arabic or Hebrew. In the same valley where the drunkard told me his great-grandfather's story, many old men told me about another belief related to Christmas. The first time I heard it, I did not believe it, it was so absurd, but after hearing about it from the lips of many people, I consider it a real belief. They say that on Christmas Eve you should open a bottle of wine or champagne with a corkscrew, pour some into the fire in the stove, and put the corkscrew on the doorstep with the tip upwards. If you don't feed the fire, the evil Elbjorg, fire offering, a naked grandmother with a red face, will come and burn the house down with her farts. And if you don't put out the corkscrew, the Yelnover, Christmas corkscrew, a huge corkscrew with legs and a hole in his hat, will come and drill holes in the walls of the house. Given that the valley is rich in psilocybin mushrooms, which the peasants there have long collected and even sold to the Germans during the war, the origin of such beliefs seems clear. Nevertheless, sitting in a hut in winter in the middle of the vast taiga, it is possible to believe in more than that, and you don't need mushrooms for that. Was having trouble finding a place to live, I got a job at an old man's bucket shop on weekends. I could spend the night in his attic. In addition to making buckets, The old man sometimes worked at a private gold mine in the mountains of Trøndelag. He told me some interesting stories about the gold-bearing river where he moonlighted as a gold digger. Though gold prospecting was more of a hobby for him, and all the members of his group lost many times more money than they earned from the gold. That river is mountainous and hard to reach. The place is so remote that it is said that the peasants there used runes 100 years ago. A group of gold prospectors work in the upper reaches, but the base for the night is at the mouth of the forest. Even near the mouth, the river can be waded across without getting your knees wet. At the base, until recently, there were a bunch of improvised devices to relax and have fun after a long day of work, spent waist-deep in perpetually cold water. 2 of them I remembered well from the story, as they are relevant to the narrative. First, the bathroom in the middle of the woods. They just make a fire under it and warm the water to bathe in. Second, a short path from the hill cleared of bushes and dead wood that can be used for skiing in winter. The first oddities began to appear at the time of the base's founding. Some of the gold diggers kept losing things. At first they suspected that there was a kleptomaniac in the group, but then it became clear that all members of the group were losing things, and it cost everyone a pretty penny, and the losses themselves occurred even when no one was at the base. There could be no thieves passing by either, the nearest place is far away, and it is impossible for a thief to walk or drive there unnoticed almost every day. In addition, gold diggers who used to walk up the river to the mine alone were constantly losing their direction and wandering until nightfall, looking for a camp. But it is physically impossible to get lost in the open area of the mountain tundra, moreover, walking along the bank of the river itself. But no, the bank just disappeared from sight and a lone gold prospector found himself in a completely unknown area. Fortunately, there were no casualties. I must say that the gold diggers were apparently so intoxicated that they even washed the gold in winter by making a hole in the ice of the river. The winter weather there is calm and surprisingly few winds, so it was not as suicidal as you might think, and a fire and good diving pants saved from frostbite. However, once the firewood dragged by sledges up the river for the fire suddenly disappeared along with the sledges, though that surprised the few, rather than angered them. Every fall, at night, cries, groans, and grunts were heard from the top of the mountain. They attributed everything to beasts, though there was one old man in the group who had heard from his parents that there were witches' Sabbaths on that mountain every autumn. Those Sabbaths are supposed to be accompanied by a fire, and there was never any light at night at the top of the mountain. As a result, several of the youngest gold diggers said they were afraid to work at the mine and left the group. One day the narrator himself climbed to the top when the first snow fell. He did it not out of curiosity, but simply to enjoy the scenery of the mountain tundra. At the top, he found huge footprints in the snow, as if an elephant had walked there. He was really frightened and ran away, but he didn't tell anyone in the group about it lest they think he was crazy. One night, one of the gold diggers decided to ski up the hill. It was a standard night in the winter. As a typical man in their oddball group, he was probably just having fun skiing in the dark and in the cold. So, as he rolled down the hill, he was met by 2 white silhouettes running up the slope on his left side. He couldn't slow down to see them, and when he got to the end of the trail, he didn't see anyone on the hill. He thought his friends were playing a prank on him, but they all appeared to be sitting in the main tent, kitchen, and no one was wearing white. In the spring, the gold diggers were once again walking up the river from the base to the mine. It was foggy and cold, such spring fog is locally called scotto. Suddenly, across the river, the group saw a shepherd's hut in the fog. Nobody had ever noticed it before, and there couldn't be any huts in those places. After crossing the river to get a closer look at the hut, the group was surrounded by dense fog in which the hut disappeared from view. Just a few seconds later, the fog cleared and the hut was gone, though the terrain itself hadn't changed. As a finale, one day something like a hurricane happened at the base. At first the sun was shining, it was warm, and butterflies were flying. Within seconds it was pouring and lightning flashed, but there was no wind. The river, always shallow and narrow, gradually turned into a huge raging river, flooding almost the entire base. Remarkably, the tents were not touched. The hill, which is used for skiing in the winter, ended up just collapsing in a mudslide. The tub, some of the flushing equipment and several cars disappeared into the waters. Then the event stopped as suddenly as it started, although the area near the mouth of the river remains flooded to this day. I never cease to be amazed at the persistence of this crew. They bought new equipment and continued their hobby as if nothing had happened, simply by moving the base to another location. The cars that had been carried away by the river were found and even repaired, as they had only floated about 10 meters. But the bathtub was not found until the same month that I worked for the narrator. We found it a few versts away from that place, where a forest is located. The bathtub was somehow miraculously on top of a pine tree, Although, let me remind you, there was no wind during the inclement weather that occurred. It happened near a forest lake, widely known in small circles as the Machine Gun Pond. In the 90s, the Norwegian mafia had set up a shootout there for some visiting Russian bandits. Negotiations didn't go well. Then the gritty Russians, apparently determined to play bratva, opened fire on the Norwegians with a fucking machine gun, which they hid in the car. They shouted something patriotic like, "This is for the siege blockers, you bastards." It so happened that after graduating from the village high school, my friends and I decided not to get too drunk and not to spend money on buying special graduation pants, as is customary in Norway. We wanted to do something memorable before uni, so we decided to try to fight with axes, like berserks, and chose the place for this experiment to be the lake, as there was a summer cabin of a friend there. To make the results of the battle more authentic, we drank 3 sevens each, some with fly agarics. I acted as a buzzkill and said that berserker did not eat fly agaric. It was invented by Swedish priests in the 18th century. We had protection, of course, our axes were slightly wrapped in rags, we wore flame retardant goggles, protective gloves, homemade chain mail, and bicycle helmets. Everything went smoothly until the rag came off my opponent's axe. The problem wasn't the rag, but the fact that we were both distracted by the rag and the axe flew millimeters from my face. At that point we calmed down and went to bed. I couldn't fall asleep and noticed that there was blood coming out of my lower lip, and quite profusely, for I noticed it by the blood-soaked pillow. The lights were off. Our axes were very sharp, so the axe that hit my lip went across it like paper, and I didn't even notice the pain, though it went pretty deep. The others didn't sleep either. We decided to drink a little more, forgetting that alcohol thins the blood, and try to sleep, and if the bleeding does not stop tomorrow, we would go to the doctor. But in the morning the blood did not stop, and the entire pillow and some of the bedclothes became brown with blood. Thinking up how we will explain the injury to the doctors, we did not notice how an old woman appeared outside the window and waved at us. It was a local healer, clairvoyant, who had rented land to the parents of the dude at whose cabin we were. So this granny came in, saw the problem with my lip, started whispering something, and the blood immediately stopped. This could be written off as a coincidence, but when the cut healed in a week, there was not even a scar. The grandmother also told us not to do this kind of crap with axes anymore. I asked, "How do you know about the axes?" We did not tell, but then I remembered that this grandmother must be considered a clairvoyant and not just a healer for a reason. What is interesting, she did all her tricks for free, unlike most other healers clairvoyants. It is worth noting that, of course, the grandmother was a gypsy, though not in the usual sense of the word, but came from the very first Norwegian gypsies who came to Norway many centuries ago. These Roma are called the Tatars, and are often forgotten, because their history contradicts the myth of the ideal development of Norway in modern times. The fact is that the Tatars in Norway until the 90s were exiled to labor colonies, taken from their children and, sometimes, even castrated. The reason was not so much the criminality of the Tatars, but their refusal to live in one place and to pay taxes honestly from their labor income. Instead, they roamed the country as part-time fishermen and blacksmiths, while the new Roma in Norway mostly just begged. It is worth mentioning that the grandmother mistook me for her brother-in-law, and invited me to visit. Passing by the lake, she asked me, "Son, do you know if anyone drowned here recently? I feel the lake is in a bad mood these days." Such words made me feel a little uncomfortable. Had anyone really drowned? And indeed, the next day a drunken fisherman drowned in the lake. The grandmother made a mistake with the date, but they didn't save the fisherman anyway. In northern Norway, working in a cemetery for a couple of weeks as a gardener, I heard from the grave diggers about a mysterious incident that happened a year before World War II. After a storm, a body washed ashore. 2 local boys came up and identified it. It was a fisherman from a nearby fjord. The fisherman's name was Stias Otter. They decided to call an adult to take him to the church cemetery or call the police. The nearest police station was still pretty far away, as was the cemetery where I was working. We temporarily dragged the fisherman's corpse to the edge of the coastal forest. They returned there an hour later, and saw another corpse, also at the edge of the forest, in torn, old-fashioned clothes, and, besides, decomposed and smelled terrible, so that even his face was not visible. Corpses, of course, cannot change their clothes, and they cannot decompose in an hour, especially since it was cold and overcast. We could have thought that the seagulls disfigured the corpse, but the seagulls had not yet flown down to have dinner, and the seagulls could not change the clothes of the corpse. Anyway, the grown-ups didn't understand what the hell was going on. They took the corpse away. Stias Otter, as it turned out later, was missing after all. The cops, without thinking too much, decided on a simple solution: to bury the corpse and write on the tombstone that it was Stiasader, though it was clear to everyone that it wasn't him at all. Only one old man believed the guys, saying that such a phenomenon often happens if a corpse drowned in the sea ends up near the forest. Then a draug emerges from the sea, a kind of drowned zombie, which takes the corpses back into the sea and either eats them, or sends them to hell, or makes new draugs out of them. And the slap comes out of the forest to meet the slap, an ordinary zombie, who wanders through the forest and collects people's corpses, too. If the slap died a long time ago, he is dressed in old-fashioned clothes, and the snog, as a rule, is dressed in mud with seashells. And so, Drew and Slap start an epic battle to decide whose corpse is whose. The drowned man, of course, thinks the corpse is his, but Slap, the bastard, says that since the corpse is at the edge of the forest, it belongs to the land. That time, apparently, the draug won, killed the Slap, and dragged the fisherman's corpse back to the sea. And the corpse of the Slap was left lying on the forest floor, and the adults found it. No one showed me the grave, but when I was mowing bushes in a corner of the cemetery, where nothing had been cleaned up for a long time, I found a gravestone covered with lichen, and I could make out the inscription: "Here lies Stephen Sutter, a brave fisherman who perished in a storm." I was not able to make out the dates, but, as I said, he died before the war began, and the spelling on the headstone referred to the same period. In Telemark, I have heard an old story that unfolded many centuries ago in a sparsely populated valley to the northeast of Bærgdrånning, the one with the mirrors on the mountain, as in Andrei Platonov's story. Once upon a time, there lived in that valley an odd-looking man. He knew of witchcraft, could carve runes, turn horses into wolves, etc. Of course, he liked to get shit-faced drunk and walk around the mountains like that. Everyone told him it would end badly and he would end up freezing to death in the mountains or being burned at the stake by the Lutherans if he didn't stop showing off. He said he would die in his own house at his own terms. He also said not to bury him, but to hang him from the ceiling in a stone coffin on brass chains, and then there would be happiness in the valley. His death was not discovered at once, for his hut was shunned by all. He did die in his house, having made a stone coffin and brass chains before his death. His desiccated corpse was found sitting at the table reading the Bible. It was done as he said, placed in the coffin and hung from the ceiling. The ceiling was of logs, of thick pines, so it could bear the weight of the coffin. In the valley, indeed, a string of bad luck began. There were cold years everywhere, resulting in bad harvests and famine, but these troubles bypassed the valley. The glaciation of the mountain trade routes caused all the merchants to rush through that valley. Within a few years, the valley went from being a bear's corner to the richest valley in Telemark. Because of this, the local peasants proclaimed the man a saint, despite the priest's protests. The priest complained to the bishop, who came and personally burned the man's house and ordered the coffin to be buried behind the church fence. The next year, cold times passed and merchants began to walk the mountain routes again. But in the valley itself there was a plague, followed by the death of livestock and crop failure. The valley became a god-forsaken place again. One day a gossipy grandmother came into the valley and said that rumor had it that hunters had seen the mountain princess walking toward the valley. If they tracked her down and shot her right in the forehead with a shotgun, she would become an ordinary but beautiful girl, and the village of whoever married her would become the richest in the country. That's the kind of hardcore stuff people thought of in these times. It is possible that the princess was invented by the grandmother herself, since the princess to be killed as a character in Norwegian folklore only exists exclusively in this story. The inhabitants, even the most skeptical, accepted this news with enthusiasm, for there was nothing to lose anyway. It was worth a try, they decided, and they set up guard posts in all the forests and mountains of the valley, armed to the teeth. One boy, who had been present with his father when the operation to intercept the princess was being planned, noticed that no one had been posted on the small mountain near his house. He decided not to ask anyone about it and went there himself to get the princess. Especially since his great-great-grandfather's abandoned hunting hut stood there. He stole his father's rifle and went to the hut. Night fell. The boy, of course, did not light any candles, and decided to sit in the dark. It was getting colder. Behind the broken window the crunching of branches could be heard. The boy stuck out the barrel of his gun through a hole in the glass and looked out into the darkness. In the moonlight between the trees there was the silhouette of a slender girl with a crown on her head. The boy was dumbfounded. The princess stood motionless, as if she could sense she was being followed, and all he could hear was her sniffling. No wonder you get a runny nose in this cold, the boy thought. He snapped out of it realizing what he was seeing and shot straight at the princess's head. The princess collapsed to the ground as if she weighed a ton. The boy sat in the hut for a long time and was afraid to come out, for he had never encountered such a thing before and did not know what to do at all. Moreover, the princess did not come to life at all. So he sat like that until dawn, and eventually fell asleep. When he woke up, he looked out the window and was surprised to find that between the trees there was a dead body. A deer. What the boy mistook for a crown were obviously antlers. The slenderness of the princess he saw was due to the fact that the deer was turned forward toward the boy, and, apparently having indeed smelled a trace, was afraid to move. None of the other posts could detect the princess. However, a lot of sawmills and peat logging soon opened up in the valley, so the peasants had money again. Not to mention the underground sale of moonshine and hallucinogenic mushrooms. So, a happy ending. I knew a journalist who wrote articles about interesting but forgotten historical figures. I used to help her with ordering and translating Soviet documents if she had to write about the fate of white immigrants in Norway or about the heroes of the Great Patriotic War who fought in northern Norway. And so, she dug up some material about an absolutely incredible Ukrainian partisan, whose name was, don't laugh, Rambovsky. This Ukrainian Rambo was captured by the Nazis and brought to Norway to build roads with Soviet and Serbian prisoners. He managed to escape and even get weapons, but not knowing the terrain, he was a partisan in the woods for 3 years right near a German military base, and yet neither the Germans knew he was there, nor did he know about the Germans. He didn't find out about the end of the war either, and the Germans in the middle of nowhere didn't get the news right away, either. So on May 12, 1945, a German patrol managed to catch him, but he escaped into the woods again and somehow managed to get 2 rifles from the Germans. In the evening of the same day, the Germans learned of the end of the war, but a mysterious submarine came ashore and took them away in an unknown direction, as witnessed by the peasants there. It is said that the Germans sailed to Argentina, which is documented, but the peasants believe, of course, that the Germans fled to Antarctica to build flying saucers. To top off this incredible story, Rambovsky was caught sleeping in a peasant's stable in the summer of 1945, taken for questioning and put in an asylum where he died. To this day, local peasants frighten their children, telling them not to walk in the woods or Rambovsky will kidnap them and take them to Russia. And so, helping the journalist with this report, I had to go with her in her car to a local farm where there lived a peasant who took food to Rambovsky. On the way, we stopped at a larger village to get some water. We stopped, however, first for a smoke in a picturesque meadow with cows right outside the village. There were 50 cows, no less, all brown. There was a hill in the middle of the meadow, overgrown with fir trees, and around the hill were bushes in which you could see a fence with barbed wire. There was a deer in the bushes, and we decided to go to the hill to see what kind of strange place it was. The deer stood staring at us dumbly until we were close to it. The cows didn't pay any attention to us either and didn't even move once. Then he hid in the bushes, climbed through a hole in the fence and walked slowly away into the woods. We crawled through that hole, too, and found ourselves in the woods. In the middle of the woods, there was a stone with runes upright. Nothing unusual about this, there are plenty of such stones in Scandinavia. Apparently, the stone was fenced in order not to be spoiled by vandals, because it already happened that by such stones drunken teenagers made bonfires and drew graffiti on the stones themselves. Nevertheless, I have never seen any archaeological finds protected with barbed wire. Also, the runestone was nowhere to be found on even the most detailed archaeological maps. The hill was probably the burial mound of a Viking. We went back to the car and decided to walk to the village to collect water. We wanted to take a little break from sitting in the car and take a walk, because we started to feel nauseous for some reason as soon as we saw the runic stone. The village was very strange. It was a weekday, but the store and the gas station were closed without any explanatory note on the door. Usually in Norway they put a note on the door with the reasons why the place is closed and when it will open, whether it's an emergency reason or even a well-known holiday like May Day or Constitution Day. There was no one on the streets, no passers-by, no bicyclists, no passing cars. Not even any birds. And all the windows of the houses were covered with curtains. We still knocked on several houses to ask for water, but no one opened the door. We put the spooky feelings aside and hurried back. Suddenly, we saw that the cows grazing in the meadow by the hill in front of the car were also gone. Where could they have all disappeared to in the 10 minutes we were gone? There were at least 50 of them. We left quickly, drove through the deserted village, and soon arrived at the farm. The owner of the farm told us about Rambovsky, after which we asked if he had noticed anything strange in the neighboring village. He looked at us strangely and shook his head in a negative way. We went back another way, bypassing the strange village. The most incredible story that ever happened to me, and I wondered if it was even worth mentioning. There was an uncle I knew at work, let's call him Niels. I worked in the fishing port of a small village between Bergen and Trondheim, on a rocky island. I worked every spring for 3 years in a row. The population of the island was mostly fishermen, and there were more Poles, Lithuanians, Siberians and Belarusians working in the port than Norwegians. And then the port burned to hell and now there are only local fishermen alcoholics left. The island is grey and unremarkable, except for the presence of Viking mounds. There used to be a quarry there, but it went bankrupt back in the 80s. The only beautiful place is one beach, where at Easter the sea becomes emerald colored, and it is also warm, so you can spend hours swimming there. But it only happens at Easter. Niels looked like that island, an unremarkable, grey, slouchy man with a taste for moonshine. He was a local himself, but he had grown up in the mountains. In his younger days he had been friends with Varg, who used to come to his cabin, because their parents knew each other. But then they quarreled, for, according to him, Varg was always whining, complaining about life, so Niels kicked him out, sometimes in the middle of the night, to go skiing in winter or biking in summer, so that Varg would quiet down. After hearing about my interest in history, in the basement of his house, Niels showed me a stone the size of a soccer ball with a phallic shape. I knew that such stones are found by archaeologists everywhere in Norway, but I was surprised when Niels told me that his late grandfather used to pass all kinds of yum, booze, oil, tar, and chicken blood to this stone, and taught Niels' mother how to do it properly. The mother, of course, did not do such a thing and hid the stone in the basement. And this grandfather believed that these were Christian rituals, and that the stone was from the place where Saint Olav had died. And in general, that we should not talk about it in vain, because it was a sacred and family matter that had been passed down from generation to generation. But that's not the point. One day, we were sitting in the village tavern after a long day's work. Not that there was any animosity, but for linguistic reasons the Norwegians were traditionally seated separately, and the Eastern European guest workers separately. I, as a person of undefined nationality, had the right to sit wherever I wanted, and that time I sat with the Norwegians. Niels told a funny story. So he won the lottery and went to see London. He's walking around the London pubs, getting drunk out of his skull. One night, when he was not too drunk yet, he got lost in London and an hour later found himself at the other end of the city, which is unreal to do on foot in such a short time. Then he went to the center, decided to climb over an iron fence and suddenly found himself on the roof of one of the annexes of Buckingham Palace. He even showed a picture, but it was so dark that I couldn't make out anything. But another colleague, who is often in London, confirmed that the view in the picture was from Buckingham. Then again, it's a pretty decent distance from the outskirts of London to Buckingham. He could no longer climb back, so he decided that he should just climb down the pipe unnoticed. It wasn't high, and, without acting nervous, like he was a palace regular or an employee, quietly go through the main gate, passing the guards there in high hats. And so the trick worked. As I found out later, he was kicked out of London the very next day because he was absolutely insane with booze, stripped naked, stole someone's jeep, crashed into a kiosk on the outskirts and demanded free cigarettes from the clerk, saying that England had been ruled by Vikings and collected tribute from it, and he had come to restore the former glorious order. When Niels told us about Buckingham he was too drunk to lie, though, of course, at first I thought it was unlikely he had beamed all over London, rather that he had just lost his way. The next working day he denied it, saying no such thing happened at all. Everyone laughed and said he was a masterful storyteller. The only one who continued to argue that Niels couldn't have been lying at the time was that London specialist. The next day I was about to leave. And so, in the evening, after finishing work, Niels called me over at the back entrance to the port and quietly said,
Okay, I did end up in Buckingham, but don't tell anybody. Do you want me to show you a trick? Don't tell anyone.
And disappeared around the corner of the harbor building, and a few seconds later he appeared from around the corner of another building in the distance, which meant he had actually teleported. He went home, waving his hand. I, seeing all this, at first did not understand at all what had happened. I was enjoying the last cigarette in the pack. And then, when Niels was out of sight, I almost shit myself and stood there dumbfounded for a long time, even though nothing really bad happened. I just witnessed a teleportation. In the morning I sailed back to the mainland and never went back to the island, nor did I ever see Niels again. I have firmly decided not to believe my own eyes in such cases, and I still believe that Niels is just a magician and a storyteller. However, the truth is, I do have my doubts. What if he really can teleport, and he was just drunk in London and couldn't do it properly? And, Even more fantastically and curiously, could this ability be connected to a family heirloom in his basement? P.S. No illegal substances were used. I have no idea what I saw myself. Along the entire border with Sweden is a succession of Swedish stores where Norwegians buy cheap booze and tobacco at Swedish prices. Also, the borderlands are sparsely populated, so it's an ideal place for fishing and a break from city life. One summer, a classmate of mine from the village high school and I, although he was then transferred to a vocational school, went to a swamp near the border to look for smoky quartz in order to make jewelry with it. We went to a bordering shop, bought some booze and cigars there, and walked 10 kilometers to a small cave, where the swamp actually begins, and in that cave we had a lodging with a barbecue and other stuff, which we had been equipped with the year before. It took a lot of effort to drag that rusty brazier from the dump across the forest, but it was worth it. The cave immediately became cozy, as if it was not somewhere remote, but close to human habitation, as if people often visit it. By the way, there are a lot of such small caves in that area, and in some of them are found rock paintings and stone tips, and the paintings themselves are cryptic, people with animal heads, all sorts of symbols, and, most importantly, footprints of human feet hollowed out in the stone. However, there are no tourists there, as it is too far to go, and archaeologists do not say a lot about it. Many years ago a pathway of planks was laid through the swamp, now partly rotten, although it is still possible to walk on it. Early in the morning we headed across the swamp to the coveted quartz spot. A frightened snipe flew out from under a bush of dwarf birches. The track was surprisingly dry, though there was a haze of fog and dew on the marsh, and in places we could even see frost on the moss, though it was summer. The first thing that gave us concern were the blue lights flickering in the morning twilight on the edge of the marsh to our right. Of course, that's how bog methane emissions glow at night, but we'd never heard that glow seen so brightly at dusk. Moreover, the lights seemed to walk, lighting up in one place. They followed the bog for 5 meters along the edge and only then disappeared. I remembered that previously it was believed that the swamp lights were the spirits of people drowned in the swamp. The atmosphere became uncomfortable. In the middle of the swamp, as the sun was coming up, we stumbled upon something more frightening. It was the wet footprints of a child's feet on the trail. Not only was the trail dry, but the footprints were crisp, as if a barefoot child had just walked here. The footprints did not run smoothly along the trail, but only occasionally, as if the walker was leaving the trail into the swamp. But there were no footprints in the swamp itself, especially since the main part of the swamp along the trail was a bog that was impossible to walk on. And what could a barefooted child do here, 10 versts from the nearest habitation? Moreover, judging by his footprints, he had walked here quite recently, and on the flat, endless swamp he would have been still visible ahead of us, even before we found his footprints, even if he had fallen in the mire head first. The question of the footprints' relationship to the footprints in the cave paintings was also on my mind. Without discussing what we saw, we turned around and headed back to the cave, spooked out of minds. On returning to the cave, our nerves finally snapped when we discovered that all our food and booze was gone. Our brazier was also gone, although who in the early morning in the middle of the forest would dare to steal our food and besides the heavy, rusty brazier that had been standing there for a year already? We ran 10 miles to the road, swearing, in less than an hour, and waited for the bus. We couldn't wait to get away from that evil place. Finally, we got on the bus. After about 10 minutes on the road, I looked out the bus window and saw a rusty barbecue on the side of the road. It was our barbecue. No one would have been able to drag it in such a short time through the woods to the side of the road 10 minutes from the turnoff to the trailhead. My comrade didn't have time to see it, and, moreover, refused to believe me. It was understandable, we have had enough of the paranormal. Obviously, we never went back there, not even to pick up the barbecue. The Mecca of ufologists in Norway is one unremarkable mountain in Trøndelag, where once, about 40 years ago, they saw a flying saucer. Since then that mountain attracts tons of tourists, mostly from the city of Trondheim, who do not see any UFOs there, but have a reason to get wasted in nature. I personally have not been on that mountain and all these stories about it I think is bait for tourists, and I myself do not believe in green men. I didn't believe in flying lights either. I did not believe until I witnessed this phenomenon twice myself. The first time was when my buddies and I rented a boat to fish off the rocky coast of northern Norway and market it to the local fish factory. We got the boat through some cronies and neither of us knew how to operate it or fish a net, and we weren't even an hour sober. Fortunately, the Coast Guard didn't stop us for checks. After 3 days without catching a thing, and nearly beaching the boat, we decided to give up and swim back to the pier, which was 5 hours away. Besides, the booze was running low, and one of us always got seasick when he was sober, so he hurried us along. Before we started back, we sat down by the board for a smoke. It was calm, and the waves which had always accompanied us before had subsided. The sun was now inclining to the horizon and was turning red, reflecting in the water with sparkling strokes. Observing the beauty of the landscape, we suddenly noticed that one of the strokes was moving vertically, as if contrary to the others, rapidly approaching us. The stroke, previously small, grew in size, and became like a shining red ball, as if a second sun was flying over the sea. The ball stopped about 50 meters from us and hovered, and we, in shock, stared at it for a few seconds, and suddenly it disappeared. Just like that, it disappeared, as if someone had turned off a light bulb. As I said, we were all in shock, so we weren't scared, but just sat and stared at the horizon for a couple of minutes. Then we went away a little and decided to sail away, having written off what we had seen as ball lightning. The second incident was in the taiga of the Telemark region and was not like a ball lightning. I worked there on a summer job in an underground mannequin warehouse. The warehouse was temporary because the owner couldn't find another place, and there were only 3 farms in the area, one of which I lived in with an acquaintance. It was a creepy job in itself, having to check every night for mold on the mannequins, carry them up in the elevator, change light bulbs, etc. But that's not the point. One weekend an acquaintance called me to the local lake to swim, since the nearest shower was a few kilometers away. I was not able to swim, because the place was mountainous and the water was barely warmer than a couple of degrees. My friend was a local and began to assure me that it was only necessary to get used to it. But his speech was interrupted by a huge herd of cows that appeared out of nowhere from behind a pine tree. They surrounded us and began mooing. As my acquaintance has explained, the cows are free-range animals there, though in Norway it is a usual practice to let only sheep graze freely. Nothing was wrong, but we decided to swim in a quieter place. We took the wood for the planned fire, booze and a guitar, and went to a nearby shore. It was a long walk, but, as my acquaintance assured me, there was a beach with a view of the mountains. The cows turned out to be friendly and followed us, but we managed to get away from them, nearly falling into the mire. In the evening we arrived at the beach, which turned out to be rocky and even colder because it was open to the wind, lit a fire, and sang Dylan songs with our guitars. The summer nights in Telemark are dark, since Telemark is not that far north. But it doesn't really get dark until after midnight. Only at 3 in the morning we were about to leave. Despite the marshy and rocky terrain, darkness and lack of trails, the acquaintance knew the area well. And then we saw in the sky that the clouds were glowing. It was a new moon, and there are no brighter auroras in Telemark, which means the light was obviously artificial. The light began to move left and right. We thought that maybe it was some SUV driving uphill through the woods and the headlights were therefore hitting the clouds. But the light started moving fast and for long distances, as if the headlights were not shining on the clouds, but a hysterically moving spotlight. But who would shine a searchlight into the clouds in the middle of the taiga at 3 in the morning? It became even stranger when the light separated from the clouds and came in a light streak downwards, and then rose sharply back up, forming a luminous square which began to make spiral motions. It lasted half an hour. Then it disappeared, and soon it was dawn. The next year I was visiting the same acquaintance. An old lady next door came to him and told him that she often saw this devilry from the window of her house and even recorded it on camera. I think she even posted it on the internet, but I could not find it. She herself considers it a natural anomaly. Something similar happened in the early 2000s, when the Russian rocket Bulava went off course and crashed, writing spiral tails in the night sky over northern Norway on the way. But the Bulava doesn't fall into the same spot over Norway several times a year. An even stranger story was told to me by a half-blind old farmer from a nearby valley, from whom I recently stopped by to buy moonshine on my way to Stavanger. When he was just a kid, he used to sled with his grandmother in the winter from a mound, yes, a real Viking mound near his farm. They also found Nefertafel there. Night comes quickly and early in the winter, so they were walking home in the dark. Suddenly they saw the same phenomenon in the sky, but this time the light ran across the sky, concentrated into a bright ball and came down on the road in front of them 100 meters away, illuminating everything around them, then took off abruptly and slowly went out. His grandmother died a week later, and he went blind and hasn't seen much since. That's the way it is, Anons. I had to walk from one valley to another once in the fall. The distance between the valleys was not the greatest, 5 kilometers. And the mountains between the valleys were not that high either. I mostly had to walk through a wooded pass between 2 mountains. At the place of the pass, 300 years ago, A Saami southerner found ore, which led to the construction of a mine of enormous size. During the war, the mine was one of the most important mines in Norway, which is why the Nazis put bunkers and towers there everywhere. In the 1970s, the mine fell into disrepair and was bought up by foreigners, who pumped acid into it to draw out the last of the ore without any work. But there was an accident and the acid poured out through the underground cracks into all the lakes. As a result, no one lives on the pass at all. The forest is mixed with piles of slag that reeks of sulfur, and the forest is full of abandons and piles of bright green lakes with nothing that grows around them. These lakes are still so dirty that they say a guy threw a scooter in there for fun, and 2 years later there was nothing left of the scooter, the acid had eaten it away. There was a Communist Party branch in the town hall until the mine was closed, and there's still a big portrait of Ilyich there. For some unknown reason, the mine is not that popular among the stalkers, but people go by the mine often, and the drunks sometimes sit there, because directly on the pass is a dirt road between the valleys just past the mine. However, the road is so decrepit that you can't drive on it anymore. The local hooligans, according to rumors, once even invited Jaeger let off there, brought the equipment, called 50 townspeople, and Jaeger himself was not against playing in abandonment, but then he had already come to Norway to perform in Oslo and Tromsø, so he could not change his plans, and then he died, so there was no concert. After walking along the road through a mossy bunker and a rusty tower, built by the Nazis and used for some time after the war, I came to a large clearing at the collapsed entrance to the mine, where the miners' hut village used to stand. Part of the village had been abandoned immediately after the war, while another continued to exist at the fading mine until the acid disaster. That is why wooden buildings such as the fireplace, the town hall, the stage of the open-air theater, the miners' dormitory, and the garage survived, while others like the old barracks, school, grocery store, blacksmith shop, and mill, abandoned after the war, had only their foundations left. Nearby stood several huge concrete towers of unknown purpose, and each tower had a tank 10 meters in diameter. A few years before, a tourist had fallen into one of the tanks in winter and, of course, could not get out and froze to death. It was overcast, and I went into the garage for a smoke. In the garage were old cars that had fallen apart. I couldn't get behind the wheel, because the seats were rotten, and some of them had fallen through the floor. On the roof of one of the cars was a piece of asbestos. On an iron table, which stood in a sort of hole in the middle of the garage, were old photographs of some old people's faces, probably recently taken out of a cabinet in the table. Around the table, broken glass covered the floor. Suddenly, in the woods that was visible through a break in the wall in the back of the garage, I saw a path unknown to me. The trails became especially visible in the fall, as all the bushes and birches growing along the trails had lost their leaves, no longer blocking the trails themselves, and the fallen leaves covered the trails with a light brown cover, making them even more visible. I don't know what got into me, but I decided to walk that trail. The trail probably just looked beautiful, because instead of crooked birches overgrown with lichen and half-naked sickly spruces, white slender birches and lush spruces grew along the trail. The soil was clean in that spot, even though it was right next to the mine. Something brown and long could be seen in the foliage by the trail in some places. Digging through the foliage, I discovered the rails. This confused me, for there had never been any rails near the mine, nor could there have been, for the nearest railroad was hundreds of yards away. It was even weirder up ahead. Far ahead, the sun seemed to be shining, though the day was overcast and drizzling with rain. After walking about 300 yards along the trail, I found myself at a long ravine with tall concrete pillars in a straight line, each with a ledge at the bottom, and something red and pink lying on each of the ledges. But it wasn't about the pillars. I had heard before that there had once been an aqueduct near the mine, though it was not clear why it had been built. It was the ravine itself. Despite the overcast weather, the sky was perfectly clear and the sun was shining over the ravine, and while the birches and aspens everywhere had lost their leaves long ago and there were frosts at night, the ravine was a verdant summer. At the right end of the ravine was a wall of large roughly hewn stones, and on the wall stood some kind of a barn, almost completely ruined. It was a wonder it had not fallen off the wall long ago. There was a rustling sound coming from the shed, audible as if someone was driving a dry palm over a drum. There were a few boards missing from the walls of the barn, but I couldn't see from my view what was inside. This did not frighten me, but rather piqued my curiosity. Though when I got down into the ravine, what I saw horrified me. The pink objects lying on the ledges of the pillars turned out to be moose or cow skulls. That is, on each ledge lay a skull, and it was still fresh, with blood and pieces of meat, as if these skulls had just been put there, pre-eaten. How I got back to the mine, I don't remember. My brain just shut down. and I just started to run away on autopilot. Of course, I told the story to my friend Jorgen, but he didn't believe me and said he would go there himself. I couldn't let him go alone, so I went with him. He assumed that some Satanists had chosen the ravine as a meeting place, but the leaves, the sun, and the rustling from the barn were harder to explain. Besides, Jorgen stated that the aqueduct was rumored to still be standing, though indeed, on concrete posts. 2 days had passed since I had first been there, so I distinctly remembered the path leading to the ravine. However, when we arrived at the garage, we didn't find any path behind it. This time I was not even surprised, but rather angry, as Jorgen began to express even more doubts. So, in spite of the rain, I just led him forcibly in about the same direction where I thought the trail should lead. And I was right. After walking more than I expected, we came to the ravine. This time it was very different. There was a rusty but intact aqueduct from the right end of the ravine to the left, and instead of a wall at the right edge, there was just a slope with spruce trees. There was no sun, and the leaves from the trees looked long since fallen. The skulls were clearly gone. Jorgen sniggered, and we walked back, as we were soaking wet. I thought it was just that ravine that was contaminated with some kind of chemical that made me hallucinate. But a week later, a group of tourists disappeared in those woods. Their remains were found only 2 years later, and right next to the aqueduct in that very ravine. As it turned out, these tourists, probably drunkenly, apparently climbed the aqueduct and it collapsed with them, covering their bodies with pipes and concrete. Here, too, Jorgen believed that it was not as simple of an answer. However, we often went to the mine and the ravine after that to tickle our nerves, but nothing much happened. As an ending to this opus, here is a long story that in many ways prompted my interest in mysticism. It happened chronologically after the story of Machine Gun Pond and before I heard the story of the gold digger. After graduating from high school, I moved to the regional capital, Trondheim, which the locals simply call the town. Despite of the population of 200,000, the city for the most part just looks like a large village with Khrushchevs and older houses, including a bunch of mansions of various kinds. I lived in a dorm, but I was kicked out of there right away because I refused to clean up and left cigarette butts and beer bottles everywhere. I did this more as a show, to spite the part of the students who, in accordance with their youthful maximalism, I considered dorks, usually without reason. So it was my own fault. I ended up sitting homeless, working as a cook, janitor, and a jester in a punk squat. I don't know a damn thing about cooking, cleaning, or music. Anyway, my cleaning didn't make the squat smell any less like hash and vomit. I don't remember how I got hired for such responsible positions, but punks are punks, they probably didn't care that much. During my service I had the right to sleep in the squat house, though I barely managed to sleep there, because punks are noisy people. For example, there was a respectable and adequate woman who, unfortunately, suffered from a kind of sleepwalking. At night she would walk down the corridor with a knife, and we had to wake her up with a bucket of water, otherwise she would stab the doors of all the rooms and wouldn't wake up in the slightest. I didn't realize at first that the lack of sleep was starting to get on my nerves, but also one of the squat girls, whose name was Nema. This girl was 10 years older than me and was a Stalinist, even though she was born in an extremely conservative country. Besides, she had 5 medals in shooting and a prison sentence for beating cops with a rebar, while not having the strongest physique and never having ever beaten or scolded one of us, including that lunatic girl. However, after being with her and an old hip guy at the fire in front of the squat, I realized that the sleepwalker and the noise at night were getting on her nerves. But Nema was by no means demanding that the sleepwalker be evicted or threatening to beat her up. On the contrary, she talked about wanting to leave the squat, and she wanted to do it secretly and without explaining why, so that no one would be upset and no one would blame the sleepwalker or her own night drinking. I did not really understand this logic, but I dared not say anything, because I was at the fire by chance, and the conversation was obviously between her and the old man. On the other hand, none of them minded my company, so I stayed. Suddenly the guy says he has some property on the outskirts of town where he doesn't live. Yeah, that's what he said, a property, not a place to live. He offered her to move there for free, and immediately, without waiting for an answer, he took the keys out of his pocket, gave them to her and told her how to get there, and then he left right away, without even saying goodbye. Neither I nor Nema, for some reason, asked the reason for his refusal to live in his own possession. Besides, I trusted the old man. He sometimes gave me good culinary advice and had once worked as a construction worker near Volgograd, so he spoke Russian and knew all of Bashlykov's songs by heart. He told me all kinds of stories about the dead guys flying around, joked about farts, and generally acted like a schoolboy. Anyway, the guy left, leaving us alone. And then I was a little taken aback. Nema, after a moment, looked at me and said that she was not used to living alone, and that if I wanted to, I could go with her. I did not refuse, for I myself was tired of noisy nights in the squat. Grandpa's place was on the outskirts of the city, on the edge of the forest, and there was even a bus, so I could continue my studies without a problem, and Nema worked in some archive in the middle of the city. This possession was a 2-story mansion, though without water or electricity. You could wash in a river not far from the house in the woods, and draw water there as well. The mansion was wooden and in good condition, the yellow paint was almost unscratched, the windows were intact, there was furniture and crockery inside, and a beautiful fireplace. I don't remember why, settled on the second floor, and Nema on the first. The only drawbacks were a bunch of spiders, no curtains, and no thermal insulation of the walls. In the first few days nothing strange happened. Nema, contrary to her logic that she was tired of the noise, threw a party the first week, inviting punks and other spiritually rich lumpen, and I invited my classmates, with whom I had no time to quarrel in the dorm. There were no houses in the neighborhood, so I could party from dusk till dawn without fear of the neighbors complaining. I was glad to meet new people, because in Trondheim I knew only Nema, the old man, and a couple of homeless people. That's when the first strange thing happened. The first people to arrive were some college kids who knew Nema from the Stalinist scene, but who hadn't crossed paths with her in a long time. It was already dark and only candles were lit in the house without electricity. So when the pickup seemed to arrive, the headlights were clearly visible outside the window. When we went out to meet the pickup, we found neither it nor the lights, and there was not a trace of tires on the dirt. We returned to the house, and then the situation repeated itself 3 times at intervals of a couple of minutes. Bored to get out, and a little scared, we left for another room. In the end, the vocational school kids showed up in their pickup truck and asked angrily why Nema didn't meet them outside, as befits a good long time since they had seen each other. When they heard our story, they did not believe us and started talking about materialism and other Marxist BS, and then the other guests came. The punks congratulated us on our housewarming, and the homeless people asked to stay with us. One of the guests said that a similar phenomenon, a glitch in the matrix, is called Fyr I Rinju and Trøndelag, but in the rest of Norway it's called Vardogel or Verdager. You can Google the word Verdager, which means warning. I remember there are many stories about a similar phenomenon. The old guy, by the way, didn't come for a drink with us. He left to work behind the Arctic Circle for a couple of years, as he told us through one of the guests, and we never saw him again. We didn't really care at first. No letters about the rent came either, which was strange. A couple of days after the booze, a neighbor came by, and she introduced herself, although, as I mentioned, we didn't have any neighbors. She didn't complain about the noise the night before yesterday, and simply said that she had walked past our house yesterday to pick berries in the woods and had seen lit candles on the windowsill of my window. We told her we were watching the house while my grandfather was away. She had lived nearby for 10 years, but she didn't know Granddad and thought the house had been abandoned. She had soon after said goodbye, and we, after a puzzled look, have discussed the strange situation and have decided to stay in the house for a lack of alternatives. More so, we could not believe the neighbor, for what on earth she had rushed to pick berries so late that she had seen the candle lit? After all, it was only the beginning of October and the darkness came quite late. We saved candles, so we lit them on the windowsills of our rooms only when it was completely dark, and so the candles burned in the evening only on the table in the common room, when we had dinner together. After discussing the cryptic nature of the situation, we looked out the window in silence at the forest. A squirrel hopped through the trees, looked at the house, and hopped away. A minute later, again, the same squirrel jumps over the trees in the same direction, looks at us and jumps away. Obviously, we only managed to finally fall asleep only in the morning. A few days later we decided to get away from the mystery of the mansion and the business of the city and went for a swim in the river, which, as I mentioned, was not far from the woods. At the river we found a long crack in the ground. You could see that the top of the crack was moss and spruce needles, but the walls of the crack were stone. The underground rock on which the forest was growing had probably cracked. But the crack seemed too long, wide and deep, so we thought there was a cave below. Deciding to check it out, we first threw a coin into the crack, but it made no sound of touching the bottom. There was probably sand on the bottom, otherwise it would have been strange. We went back to the house and made a lot out of rope from the wires used for drying laundry. We used an empty vodka bottle as the weight. The bottle went down and did not think of touching the bottom or getting stuck, but it kept bumping against the walls of the crevasse. That is, there was no cavity under the rock, but neither did the crack get narrower as it got deeper. In the end, the length of the rope was not long enough for the bottle to touch the bottom. Suddenly, it seemed as if someone had yanked the lot. At any rate, Nema, who was holding the lot, released the end of the rope, and cried out. I assumed it was just her imagination, though I saw the rope yanked down myself. Maybe a piece of rock had fallen on top of the bottle, chipped off the fissure wall, and dragged the bottle down. But there was nothing to be heard from the crevasse. Something just yanked the end of the rope out of Nema's hand, and it was as if the bottle that had been banging against the crevasse had never been there at all. After swimming, on our way to possession, we discovered another strange thing. In the middle of the woods, in a place we thought we had passed several times before, there was a brand new iron fence, enclosing a square of about 16 square meters. There was barbed wire on the fence and nothing inside except a few rotten planks, and the fence looked no more than a few years old. After looking at this strange structure, we decided to return home as soon as possible. The events that happened to us after the housewarming were not particularly frightening, but their frequency and mystique alarmed us, and it manifested itself in insomnia. And it was from lack of sleep that we moved here. Soon we noticed that the spiders in the house disappeared. Another interesting phenomenon was that we never saw any birds around the house, except rodents and moose. The mood was clearly oppressive. One night, on my way home from the bus stop, I heard a rustling in the bushes on the left side of the road. I didn't see anything special there. I shined my flashlight over there and was stunned. There were several half-meter-tall black silhouettes wobbling in the bushes, their eyes glowing in the light of the flashlight. I don't know how many seconds we stood there staring at each other, but I finally snapped out of it and ran to the house, where Nema was waiting for me for dinner. I do not remember how I reached the house, but for a long time, when I crossed the threshold, I just sat in the corner and was in a state of shock before I could explain anything to a perplexed Nema. This place was getting to me, and apparently the devil in the bushes was the last straw. Nema tried to reassure me by speaking in the calm, almost theatrical language she used when she was unsure of her own thoughts.
Think as you always think, there can be a rational explanation for everything. Isn't the mystery of the events surrounding this place the uniqueness of being here with you? It's more interesting than frightening.
Then I put forward the version that when one thinks about something, one begins to notice it better everywhere, and so the object of one's thoughts becomes more and more real. For example, if you believe in a conspiracy, you start to see proof of it everywhere, though these are just facts which you notice and subconsciously ignore the rest. Such is the case with mysticism as well. The grandpa probably gave Nema the apartment not with malice, but out of kindness, and the neighbor was really a distant neighbor, and nobody yanked the lot, and all I saw in the bushes were cats. The next day, however, she confessed that she couldn't sleep. Neither could I. All night long I kept seeing sounds and shadows outside the window. The silhouettes I had seen were not cats, they were too tall for cats and badgers. And they couldn't have been deer, too low. They were too wide for dogs, and dogs are unlikely to stand so still. Well, in general in Norway there are no stray dogs, especially pack dogs. They are immediately recaptured and put to sleep. And certainly these silhouettes were not owls. Even if there are such fat owls, they do not sit in the bushes on the vacant lot by the road, but rather on boughs in the woods. In short, we decided to leave this mansion for good. We took our things and cleaned up. We have not taken anything from the house itself. It is unlikely that the old man will come back and find something important for him missing and will think how ungrateful we are. And in general, we did not want to take anything from that house, for who knows what the hell it might entail. Besides, winter was coming, and without insulation, no fireplace could save us from January frosts. We had to find a new place before the first frost. We locked the door with the key and put it under the rug. Nema temporarily went to her parents abroad, but I never saw her again, and I was expelled the same week for failing a grade and went to the south to look for work.